Hello, welcome to BCOM Chapter 3, Planning Spoken and Written Messages. This chapter is in conjunction with Chapter 4 that will talk about preparing spoken and written messages, but today we look at planning. And if you look on page 37, you'll see a timeline for these two chapters that cover 6 different steps through the planning and the preparing of spoken and written messages. Today, during this lecture, Chapter 3, we're going to be looking at the first 4 steps. To begin with, the first step is to determine the purpose and the channel. This is deceivingly simple. It is so important, so necessary for you to begin thinking about what you want to say and how you're going to communicate that message. Most people just quickly, on the fly almost, try and prepare their messages and send them off in the most convenient channel available. But giving it some thought, thinking about what you want to say, making certain that all of the necessary facts that the reader will need to know are included in the message, and then finding the best channel for sending that is very difficult to do. One of the things we must do is to know our speaker very well. That's the second step in the planning process. Know and envision the audience. Imagine who we are communicating to. It's so important to know this. If we're going to understand whether the purpose of our message is being met, we have to know who our audience will be, and we have to ask ourselves, what do they need to know? What questions will they ask after looking at our message? What will their concerns be? What will their emotions be? All of these things factor into knowing whether our message is going to be communicated well or not. So the second step, after we've determined our purpose and the best way to communicate our message, the second step is to decide just exactly who our audience is going to be. We call this audience analysis. We can look at a number of different things. First of all, there is a demographic perspective of our audience. We look at their ages, we look at their gender, we look at their social backgrounds, their economic backgrounds, maybe their geographical locations. A lot of different factors go into the demographics of who our audience is or is going to be. For example, if you're asked to address a group of people about a particular topic, what kinds of questions would you want to know about that audience? Well, you'd want to know, first of all, where they came from, what their interests are. You would want to know how much they already know about the topic. You would want to know how many people will be there. And again, their ages and the demographic information. All of these go into knowing your audience well. And by knowing your audience well, you may begin to tailor your message toward them. One thing that often confuses people is the culture of the audience. When we encounter different cultures, many times it makes it more difficult to communicate our message. One thing the textbook talks about is to avoid colloquialisms and jargon. Make sure that we use simple language and terms that people from other cultures will be able to understand. And more, we're encountering this as we involve ourselves in business communication. We're finding ourselves with people who are from different cultures. Trying to project the audience's emotion and their feelings as they read your message is very critical to knowing how it will be received. So all of this goes into knowing who your audience is. Do a thorough audience analysis. So the first 2 steps are really very difficult, but they need to be done. Know, first of all, the purpose and the information that needs to be included in your message and the best way to communicate it. The second step is to know your audience, to do an audience analysis. The third step, once you know your audience, is to adapt your message to your audience so they can easily understand it. The textbook talks about 4 different points to help us achieve a proper adaptation of our message to our audience. First of all, focus on the receiver's point of view. The textbook talks about an I attitude and a you attitude, or an I-centered message or a you-centered message. So if I'm talking to you about what I think is important in a message, all of a sudden you hear me talking about myself a lot. But if I'm talking about you and what's important to you and how I can communicate to you the things that you need to know, you hear so many yous, it's a you-centered message. We are talking to the receiver of the message, and we want them to know that our concern is about them and not about us. We use you language. A second thing that we do to adapt our message to an audience is to communicate ethically and responsibly. Take a look at this section of the textbook. It's very important that we understand that we must be ethical in all that we say, in all that we do. We want to be truthful, we want to be honest, and we want to make certain that the message is understood from a proper perspective. How are we ethical in our communication? Well, one way is to prove our point by giving facts and details sufficient to show that we're not just speaking from our opinion, but we're actually giving truth as best we can. Take a look at graphics. Are they distorted in such a fashion that they're hard to read or they misinterpret the information? It's important that we be ethical and truthful as much as we can. The third step is to communicate goodwill. It's important that our receiver knows that we really care about him or her. And so we communicate goodwill through tact and through diplomacy and through a positive tone in our message to communicate the idea that people do care, that we do care about the people we're communicating to. We want to be careful about euphemisms, and the textbook talks about euphemism, an easy way to say something very difficult. And there it gives some examples about this. One that I see so many times that concerns me is the phrase, "Oh, well, my brother passed on." I wonder why we don't just come out with what actually happened to this brother. My brother died. Why do we try to soften it so much that sometimes I wonder, well, where did he pass on to? Pass on to Washington, pass on to Colorado, or pass out on a bed or something? I don't know. It's important that we just be very plain and simple and clear and avoid euphemisms as much as we can. Also avoid double speak, also known as double talk or corporate speak, in which we use jargon that is difficult for people to understand if they're not within the organization itself. Avoid condescending or demeaning expressions. Use connotative words fewer than we use denotative words. Denotative word is the literal meaning of the word, but connotative word is the literal meaning that comes across with a kind of a judgmental tone to it. It can be useful, it can also be harmful. Be very clear and specific using the denotative terms. Use language appropriately, be very factual about what we say, and the textbook spends a lot of time talking about a lot of different specific issues here to try and be very clear of what we're saying. The fourth step in adapting our message to our audience is to use contemporary language. Be careful that we don't use outmoded language or phrases that are a generation or two or three or four even years old. Eliminate profanity, avoid cliches, and be very current in the kinds of language and terminology that we use to express. The fifth is to use simple language, simple words, words that can easily be understood. I talked to someone once who felt like if he could use big words, he would impress people. But that doesn't impress people. It confuses people. They may think, well, maybe this person is a smart person, but if they were smart, they'd be able to communicate better with me. Use simple words that people will understand your message. This is especially true in business, where we're trying to persuade people, to convince them of different things. Use language that they will understand. Communicate concisely is the sixth point about adapting to an audience. Avoid redundancies if possible, although many times redundancies can help us to reinforce our message. So this is sometimes a very tasteful issue, being redundant to reinforce our message, but not being so redundant that we bore people by repeating ourselves constantly. Also, using the active voice is very important. And look at your text and the example that it gives to give you an idea of what the active voice is all about. The active voice is you doing the action or someone doing the action. The passive voice is having the action done to them. Be careful that you can notice the difference between the active and the passive voice, and the more you exercise the active voice in your business writing, the stronger your writing will become. The last point of being adaptive to your audience or adapting your message to your audience is to project a positive and a tactful tone. The more you do this, the more positive you will be. And once again, the textbook gives a number of examples and illustrations that will be useful to you. We've taken a look at the first 4 steps toward planning your writing, first 3 steps. The 4th step then is organizing the message. I encourage all students to make an outline of what they want to write. By preparing an outline ahead of time, even knowing that you may not keep to it, that you may have to adjust it or change it as time goes by, you will be able to find a structure that you may follow that will help you to write. And by creating a structure that helps you, the writer, you also will help the reader to follow your material and to understand better what you're saying. Create outlines. They can be very useful. Sequence your ideas clearly so that one idea follows the other and one builds upon the next one. They build upon each other so that by the time you get to the end of a presentation, you have laid the foundation or the framework for people to fully understand what your message is all about. Define first of all what the central idea is in your message and what the reader's likely response will be to it. And one way you can do that is by writing either deductively or inductively. We're going to talk about this in the next few chapters when we take a look at them. But to write inductively is to prepare your points or your proofs ahead of time and present them and then come to the conclusion that you want to make about those proofs. To write deductively is to make your general statement first and then follow that general statement with the reasons for why you developed it. Developing strategies of either inductive or deductive presentation can help you to communicate messages given a particular audience, given a particular attitude of the message that you have to communicate, and will help you in communicating emotional issues that sometimes carry a lot of gravity and influence people. The example on page 53, or the graphic at the top of the page, will help you to have a better understanding of the deductive and the inductive approach. I hope this has been useful for you. It's trying to encourage, this whole chapter is trying to encourage you to plan your writing before you sit down and write. The last thing a writer should do is just to sit down and start throwing ideas onto paper and assume that just because they're down on paper, they'll be in a format that will be easy for the reader to understand and the message will be communicated. In truth, we must know our reader. We must know the needs of our reader and how the reader will receive the message we're communicating, and we must develop our message that meets the needs of the reader. When we do that, and when we put our message into a strategy that helps the reader to understand it, then we will be able to communicate better. Now, I've been talking a lot about readers in this chapter and in my discussion of the chapter, but the same thing is true for speakers as well, those who are presenting an oral presentation. You must know your audience, you must prepare your materials, and you must present it in such a fashion that your listeners will want to listen, will understand as they listen, and will accept your message and respond the way you want them to. I hope you'll plan ahead in your messages and prepare good outlines that help you to present the material the way you want to, and word it in such a fashion that it makes sense and appeals to the readers. As you do so, you will be a good business communicator.